Okay, let's unpack this. The way the global economy looks today is, well, almost unrecognizable compared to just 1,000 years ago.
It really is.
We're talking about a population that's multiplied 22 times, average income per person jumping 13-fold,
Uh-huh.
and a total world economy that's nearly 300 times bigger. Now, get this. In the 1,000 years before that,
Yep.
population barely inched up, only about a sixth, and incredibly, there was essentially zero progress in average income.
Zero. It's stunning when you put it like that.
It's a mind-blowing difference.
What's truly remarkable is the sheer acceleration that occurred. I mean, for the vast majority of human history, significant economic growth was just, well, a rarity.
Right.
Then something fundamentally changed. And this deep dive is dedicated to understanding that monumental shift.
Exactly.
We've got Professor Elliott's lecture, which gives us this fantastic 2,000-year overview of the global economy.
Mhm.
And our goal is really to extract the most critical insights into these long-term transformations.
So if you've ever wondered how the world's economy evolved into what it is today, you're in the right place.
Absolutely. We're going to try and get that crucial long-term perspective for you without getting too bogged down in, excessive detail.
Right. So as we look back at this enormous span of time, there are a couple of main ways historians and economists have thought about the world before this massive growth really kicked off.
Okay.
The first, often called the Malthusian worldview, it paints a pretty consistent picture of stagnation.
Stagnation, yeah.
Imagine a world where, for centuries, most countries were operating on a similar level. People were largely focused on just surviving.
Right, subsistence level.
And there wasn't really any significant increase in what each person could produce. Think of a flat line on a graph showing income per person, staying right near the bottom until the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, Clark highlights that view really well in his 2007 work. He even presents a stylized graph showing exactly that income per person just kind of bumping along until around 1800.
It's this idea of humanity being stuck in a Malthusian trap.
Exactly. But then, building on that idea, there's another way of looking at things. The gradualist worldview.
Okay, how's that different?
Well, this perspective suggests that even before the Industrial Revolution, things weren't completely static. Countries were, developing in their own unique ways.
Oh, okay.
And people generally weren't living right on the edge of starvation. There was a slow but continuous increase in per capita output.
So not completely flat.
Not completely flat. Consider historians like Landis, writing back in '69, and the extensive work of Madison. They point out that Europe, for example, had already built up some wealth before industrialization.
How?
Through things like investment, exploiting resources from other parts of the world, and even some advancements in technology. Madison's view shows more of a gentle upward slope in income per person before it really shoots up after the Industrial Revolution.
So we've got these two contrasting pictures. One of a world stuck in neutral, maybe. The other of a world slowly but surely making progress.
Right. It really makes you think about which one aligns better with the historical evidence.
And that's a key question we need to consider. Now, focusing on that incredible transformation we mentioned at the start, the numbers themselves are just jaw-dropping.
They really are.
The 1,000 years after 1000 AD saw world population surge 22-fold and average income per person jump 13-fold.
Huge increases.
But the 1,000 years before, as we said, almost no change in per capita income and only a modest increase in population.
What's fascinating here, though, is that the vast majority of that per capita income growth is actually a relatively recent phenomenon.
Really?
Yeah. Between the year 1000 and 1820, progress was incredibly slow. The global average only increased by about 50%.
50% over 800 years.
Pretty much. Most of the economic activity in that period was simply keeping pace with a fourfold increase in population. The aha moment here is realizing that it's only after 1820 that things truly accelerated.
That's the turning point.
Since then, per capita income has skyrocketed more than eightfold, and population has also grown significantly, more than fivefold. This really underscores the dramatic speed up we've witnessed in just the last couple of centuries.
But it's crucial to remember that just looking at income doesn't give us the full picture of how people are doing, right?
Absolutely not.
There's more to well-being than just how much money people have.
Exactly. Per capita income is an important piece of the puzzle, but if we connect this to broader measures of well-being, the extent of progress becomes even clearer.
Like what, for instance?
Well, let's take life expectancy as an example. Around the year 1000, the average newborn wasn't expected to live much beyond 24 years.
24. Wow.
Today, the global average is around 66 years. That's a truly dramatic improvement and a tangible sign of progress in areas like healthcare, sanitation, nutrition, things that go beyond just economic output.
And just like everything else in history, this growth hasn't happened evenly across the globe, has it?
Not at all. It's a really critical point.
Some regions have experienced far more significant changes than others.
Exactly. The increases in both income and life expectancy have been most pronounced in Western Europe, North America, Australasia, and Japan.
The West, essentially, plus Japan.
Pretty much. If we look at the data, by 1820, this group, let's call them Group A, like the lecture does, had already pulled ahead, achieving an average income level roughly twice that of the rest of the world.
Okay, twice as much by 1820.
But fast forward to 1998, and that gap had widened dramatically. Group A had an income level 7 times higher than the rest.
Wow, that's a massive divergence. 7 times. And the lecture even highlights the stark contrast in income between the U.S., a leading economic power today, and Africa, which is the poorest region.
Yeah, what was the figure?
It's something like a 20-to-1 ratio.
20 to 1.
And unfortunately, that gap has actually been widening. So it's definitely not a uniform story of global progress.
And this raises an important question about why some regions have grown so much faster than others. I mean, while it might be easy to assume this widening gap is inevitable,
Right.
the lecture points out that it isn't necessarily. We've seen countries in Asia, particularly in the last half century, demonstrate that significant catch-up is indeed possible.
That's true, thinking about East Asia.
Exactly. However, it's also important to remember that global economic growth overall has actually slowed down since around 1973.
How interesting.
And some parts of the world have unfortunately experienced stagnation or even economic decline, which partially offsets the progress we've seen in Asia. It's a complex picture.
Okay, so what were the main drivers behind this incredible period of growth, especially after 1000 AD? What were the key factors that allowed for this sustained increase in both income and population?
Well, what's fascinating here is the interaction of 3 key processes.
Like 3 main things.
Yeah. The first was the conquest and settlement of relatively empty and fertile lands. Think places like the Americas, Australasia.
New resources, new space.
Exactly. These new territories often provided valuable resources and opportunities for the transfer of people, crops, and livestock.
Yeah.
Huge impact.
Okay, what's the second?
The second crucial driver was the expansion of international trade and the flow of capital across borders. Money and goods moving more freely.
Globalization starting to take shape.
You could say that. And the third, arguably the most fundamental in the long run, was technological and institutional innovation.
So new inventions, new ways of organizing things.
Precisely. New and better ways of doing things, and improved frameworks like property rights, legal systems for organizing economic activity. These 3 things working together.
And the lecture really emphasizes the 19th century as a major turning point, right? A distinct new era in global economic history.
Absolutely.
What was it about the 1800s that made them so special? Why then?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the 19th century marks the beginning of the first truly globalized economy.
The first one?
Yeah, in this modern sense. We saw a significant increase in market integration and, crucially, the prices of goods starting to converge across different parts of the world.
Price convergence. What does that mean exactly?
It means the price of, say, wheat in London wasn't wildly different from the price of wheat in New York after accounting for transport costs. That suggests a truly linked market.
Okay.
And while there were earlier periods of significant economic change, think the rise of empires before the 15th century, or the great voyages of discovery.
Columbus, da Gama.
Right. Or even the moves toward freer trade in the 20th century, the 19th century, was fundamentally different because of this widespread price convergence.
So it wasn't just that more goods were being traded. The lecture makes a point that increased trade on its own wasn't enough to guarantee sustained growth in earlier times.
Exactly right. That's a key distinction.
Why is this price convergence so important then?
Simply having more goods moving around the world isn't sufficient for creating a truly integrated global economy that drives sustained growth. What the lecture highlights is that in earlier periods, even after those major discoveries, there wasn't much actual price convergence.
Why not?
Early trade often focused on luxury goods, spices, silks, things that didn't really compete with locally produced items in, say, Europe.
Ah, okay. Non-competing goods.
Right. This kind of trade was more about taking advantage of big price differences for profit, what economists call arbitrage, rather than fundamentally raising living standards by making essential goods like grain or textiles more affordable and widely available because of global competition.
Got it.
In a truly integrated global economy, the prices of basic goods should be increasingly determined by global supply and demand, not just by what's happening within a single country, like its specific amounts of land and labor available.
Okay, so this leads us to the first model of globalization presented in the lecture, which comes from the work of O'Rourke and Williamson. Can you break down how this model helps explain this critical shift?
Certainly. It's quite an elegant model, actually. It examines the relationship between a country's amount of land relative to its labor force. That's the RL ratio.
And to labor ratio, okay.
The price of agricultural goods compared to manufactured goods, PAPM. And the ratio of wages paid to workers compared to the income generated by land, like rents, WR. Wage rental ratio.
Right.
Now, imagine a closed economy one with very little international trade. In this scenario, if the amount of land per worker decreases.
So more people, same land, like population growth.
Exactly. More people trying to live off a limited amount of land. You typically expect the price of food, agricultural goods, to go up relative to manufacturers as food becomes relatively scarcer.
Makes sense.
And you'd also expect wages to fall relative to land rents because labor becomes more abundant and land becomes more valuable.
Okay.
So the key insight here is that in a pre-globalized world, a country's economic conditions, its prices, its wages relative to rents, were much more tightly bound to its own resource base, its own RL ratio.
That makes sense within a self-contained system. But how does the introduction of international trade change that fundamental relationship?
Right, that's the crucial part. The aha moment of this model is seeing how opening up to trade fundamentally alters these relationships. It allows countries to sort of overcome their domestic limitations.
How so?
In a global economy, a falling land-to-labor ratio in one country doesn't necessarily lead to a rise in the relative price of agriculture or a fall in the wage-to-rental ratio within that country.
Why not?
Because prices and factor returns, wages, and rents become increasingly influenced by global markets. A country with less land per worker, like maybe Britain in the 19th century, can import agricultural products from countries with more abundant land, like the US or Argentina. This helps keep food prices down domestically.
Okay, cheap imports.
And it can allow wages to rise relative to rents, potentially, as a country specializes in producing other goods and services, maybe manufactured goods, for the global market.
So trade breaks the local link.
Exactly. Think of it like this. A country that's crowded but good at making manufactured goods can trade those goods for food from a less crowded agricultural country. This breaks the direct link between their own land scarcity and the price of food, or the returns to labor and land.
And the lecture then looks at historical data from England to see if this model holds up in the real world, right?
Precisely. It examines the trends in these key variables: land-to-labor ratios, wage-to-rental ratios, and the relative prices of agricultural goods over a long period in England.
What did the data show?
The data, spanning from 1565 way up to 1936, but split around the 1820s, reveals a really interesting shift before the 1820s.
It's a closed economy, period.
Arguably, yes. As England's land-to-labor ratio declined, more people per acre, the relative price of agricultural goods tended to increase, and the wage-to-rental ratio tended to decrease, just like the closed economy model predicts.
Okay, so the internal factors dominated.
It looks that way. This strong connection suggests that England's economy was largely operating as a relatively closed system. During this time, its domestic resource situation heavily influenced its prices and the relative returns to labor and land.
Okay, so a more self-contained economy where what was happening within England's borders was the main driver. But what changed after the 1820s?
Well, after the 1820s, even though the land-to-labor ratio in England continued to fall, the relationship with those other economic indicators changed significantly.
How did it change?
The relative price of agricultural goods started to fluctuate more and even began to decline at times, despite the falling RL ratio. And crucially, the wage-to-rental ratio actually started to rise.
So the opposite of what happened before.
Pretty much the opposite trend for wages versus rents, yes. This break in the previous correlations indicates that something fundamental had shifted.
Globalization kicking in.
That's the argument. England's wage-rental ratio was no longer primarily determined by its own balance of land and labor, but was increasingly influenced by its ability to trade, particularly importing cheaper food from countries like America that had more abundant land. It's as if the economic playing field had suddenly become much larger.
So the 1820s really do appear to be a crucial turning point, a moment where the rules of the economic game started to change because of increasing global interconnectedness.
That's the key takeaway from this part of the analysis. The evidence strongly suggests that the 1820s marked the beginning of a truly new, more integrated global economic system.
And this helps explain the divergence we talked about earlier.
Exactly. The lecture argues that this shift helps explain why we see that acceleration of economic divergence in the GDP per capita data and graphs, particularly after the 19th century.
Right. When Western Europe, the Western offshoots like the US and Australia and Japan really started to pull ahead economically.
Yes, during this period of increasing globalization, this, in essence, launched a new epoch of world history. Modern economic growth, characterized by sustained and, for some, rapid increases in living standards.
And there's other data supporting this.
Yeah, the lecture briefly shows other indicators consistent with this epoch too, starting around then. Things like the diverging real wages of skilled workers between different countries, the significant decrease in transportation costs shown by falling freight rates, and even periods of lower tariffs, suggesting reduced barriers to trade. It all points towards a fundamentally different economic environment taking shape.
So just to quickly recap then, we've seen this incredible economic transformation over the last couple of centuries.
A huge shift.
A stark contrast to the much slower pace of change in the preceding millennium. This shift was accompanied by a widening gap in wealth across the globe.
The Great Divergence.
And the 19th century, particularly around the 1820s, seems to be the pivotal moment, ushering in a new era of globalization driven by trade, especially trade that led to price convergence, which fundamentally altered economic relationships and propelled modern economic growth, at least in some regions.
Precisely. And understanding these long-term trends, these deep historical roots, provides such a vital framework for understanding so many of the economic debates and challenges we're grappling with today.
Yeah, it really highlights just how interconnected the modern world is and how different the underlying economic forces are compared to, say, the world before 1800.
Absolutely. It puts today's issues into a much broader context.
So here's something to really think about, maybe mull over after listening. Given these historical patterns of economic divergence and the fact that, as you mentioned, global economic growth has slowed down somewhat recently,
Since the 70s, yeah.
what kinds of challenges and opportunities might we expect as the global economy continues to evolve in the years to come? It really makes you wonder what the next chapter in this 2,000-year economic story will look like.